All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, What a Retailer is Looking For from a Smaller Emerging Brand, Part 1, Securing Your Appointment and Preparing for the Meeting. My name is Ari Sherman. I'll be your moderator today. I'm the co-founder and president of the brand Evo Hemp and part of the Road to Retail team. I'm pleased to introduce one of today's speakers, Tracy Priest. Tracy is a 30-year veteran of the consumer packaged goods industry, rich with experience in both sales and marketing. Tracy held several sales positions at blue chip companies where he drove specific programs, increasing both market share and sales with large retailers in all classes of trade. For more than a decade, Tracy has owned and operated his own sales and trade marketing consulting firm, providing sales leadership with some of the most notable CPG companies and emerging brands. I'm also pleased to introduce our other speaker today, Bruce Montgomery. Bruce has been in commercial operation functions within consumer packaged good firms for the majority of his 30-year career. He has served in executive leadership positions in marketing, sales, business development, new product development, logistics, store brand, and brand acquisitions and divestiture. He was part of the executive team that led the successful sale of Fleet Laboratories to private equity in 2015. Before I hand over the mic to Tracy and Bruce, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about this presentation. First, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session, as well as a downloadable PDF of this presentation deck. Links will be sent to everyone that attended. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question from one of our speakers, please feel free to submit your questions at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session. If we don't get to your question during today's webinar, we'll be sure to follow up afterward. And last, we'd like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks. So without further ado, let's get started on the road to retail. So here are some of our key learnings and summaries after speaking with a handful of various retail buyers across multiple categories. So our first question is, this one will start with Tracy. What gets a buyer to agree to meet with a smaller emerging brand?
I think I'm going to turn this one over to Bruce, and then I'll comment. So you take this one, Bruce.
Right. Thanks, Tracy. There'll be plenty of time. We only have 287 slides to get through here this morning. So thanks for everyone's time. So good afternoon, folks, or good morning. Thank you for spending the time with us. So the thing that I want to set here is you really need much more than just an excellent product. As we spoke with these buyers, they said, when we meet with these enthusiastic, smaller and emerging brands, the enthusiasm and the high quality product is really just the table stakes to getting into the game. So what we're hoping to communicate here today is some of the other things that these buyers told us what it takes to get their attention at these large retailers. So let's go through these points and add a little bit of color. So the first one was, if I get a call from somebody I trust. So this can be a specialty broker that might specialize in a Whole Foods or a Publix or a Walmart, someone that the buyer has a history with, that when this man or woman calls them and says, hey, you should really take a look at this, it tilts the scale a little bit in your favor that they're going to look at that, fondly. We heard more than once that relationships really matter, okay? Oh, yeah. Also, if you have a past contact, so if you've worked at another firm and had success at a particular retailer, you have a leg up because they understand that you know how to get things done within their firm. Next, we covered this a little bit, but is the brand being represented by a broker I trust and respect? So many of the large retailers, there's a whole network of firms that just take care of business at that retailer. But they're not all equal in terms of how they're held in regard by the retailer or the different categories. So if I'm selling a cookie, let's say, going to a great HBA OTC broker for assistance may be somewhat helpful, but it's not as helpful as going to someone who really knows the cookie category and the buyers over there. We talk about what kind of meeting will you get? And these buyers said, well, I'll either give you 10 minutes, 20 minutes, because I believe that everyone deserves that amount of time, or you may get a really long meeting if the buyer sees a couple of things. If they see that you're getting traction either in their IRI or Nielsen data, or if you may have some distribution in a retailer that they respect or really track closely as a competitor, that'll be very helpful. And they also want to know, we heard this several times as well, different makes a difference, okay? One quote that sticks with me is, we don't want cut and paste. You know, they don't need the third of the exact same thing, because if you're gonna bring that, you better be prepared to give up a lot of margin, and you'd best be a low-cost producer. Next, they need to see real dollars committed to this launch. We had one instance where a buyer said the product in question looked very interesting, but the company was so tiny. I made their president show me their balance sheet that they actually had dollars on hand to launch this the way they said they were going to. I thought that was pretty telling. No one's ever asked me to show them my books before, but this is a very large retailer, and he made no bones about asking that question. They also need to know that you have money, that if you are successful gaining distribution at these large retailers, that you can actually ship a big order. Tracy will talk about this in greater detail, if not today, but in session 2 next week. One of the worst things that can happen is you work really, really hard, you gain acceptance, they give you an order, and it's bigger than you thought, and you can't ship it, because cutting that first order, we heard from all these buyers, is just death. Another thing that helps you get these initial meetings is the leadership of this small brand or emerging company credible? Do you have a history in the industry? Do you have a history of doing what you say you're going to do within that retailer? And are you funded? A lot of these buyers are not going to take a flyer with their careers on a company that they're not sure is viable. And lastly, before I turn it over to Tracy to add color here, is does the brand in question match our corporate strategy? An extreme example might be if you're making a natural or organic high-end skincare line, does that really make sense to go into the dollar class of trade? So you really need to think through not only the environment for your brand where you want to be, but is it a match? I mean, 10,000, 15,000 stores at a Dollar General on paper sounds great if all you're doing is falling for the siren song of store doors. But if that's not a match for your product, don't waste your time going in there, because they're going to tell you that it's too expensive and not a match for their shopper. So understand what you're asking for. Tracy, any color to add here, please?
Oh, absolutely. A couple things, Bruce, and great job going through all this, because we did certainly learn a lot. One of the other things I wanted to add on this too is, other than being recommended by somebody you trust, a couple buyers said, hey, if I met you at Expo West, or I met you at a distributor show or whatever, you know, I know what you look like, and I had some kind of small interaction with you. If you reach out to me for a meeting, that would definitely help. So if you're at any kind of trade event, get a card and then reach out and say, hey, I remember, you know, meeting you. I'd like to further our conversation. Also, I can't reiterate enough how buyers are looking for innovation and brands and products that are on trend. So we heard that, and I heard that a lot in the interviews that I did. And then I wanted to give an example of, does the brand match our corporate strategy? An example would be KeHE, which is a major distributor. They're a B Corp. So if your company is a B Corp, you know, that's a good match for your company. So wanted to give you that as an example of how your brand may match, you know, a corporate strategy. And then just wanted to emphasize again, if you've got a leadership team that is, you know, has got a track record, they've been at another brand that has sold or has had a lot of success, that really does play an important role. And I guess another key point, Bruce, I really wanted to emphasize is you've got to have a retail support plan going in. Not only a marketing support plan, but also a retailer specific plan. And we'll get into a little bit more later in a couple slides about what that means. But definitely they're looking for how you're going to not only get your product, on the shelf at a retailer, but how are you going to get it in the consumer's basket? And that is through your marketing approach to consumers, as well as through, the retailer or distributor.
Thanks, Tracy.
Wow.
Hey, Ari, one other thing before we move on, please. Another note here that Tracy jarred was, we heard from a couple of the different retailers that if when you go in and meet with them, you show a willingness to tailor an offering for their class of trade or account, that shows you get it, that not all classes of trade are the same. So if you're going for something in extreme value grocery or the dollar class of trade, there's those certain price points you have to come in underneath. Or if you're fortunate enough to be able to be considered for something like a Costco or a Sam's Club, that's a whole nother beast. So while that does complicate your operations and more SKUs to keep track of, it also shows you are alert to the fact that not all classes of trade have the same needs, and that will score you some points that you've done your homework coming in. Ari, I think we're ready for the next one, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tracy and Bruce. Those, both, incredibly helpful. I know from my personal experience, one of the most challenging things to do to actually even get in front of one of these buyers is, what we've really found is, finding brokers that the brands, really trust, or that the retailers really trust. That can be incredibly important. It's really hard for these, buyers to manage their time. And, one of the ways that they do that is really just connecting with somebody that they know. And so that I really recommend, any small emerging brand, find brokers, find, sales agencies to really help get their foot in the door. So for the next question here, for small brands, what are some of the meeting expectations of the buyer?
Yeah, and I'm going to take this one. So I just can't emphasize enough, I think, from every buyer that we talk to during our interview process, the words that kept coming up is be organized, be focused, be concise. Don't waste my time. That's a precious, commodity, as we said here, time and space. So that just was reiterated, I think, by almost every single buyer that we talked to. Another advice I want to give our audience today is, don't bring in a 40 to 70 page deck. They don't want to see it. Again, every buyer I think we talked to said 10 to 12 pages is perfect. I think Bruce had an interview with a buyer who said that the brand came in with a one-page sell sheet and sold the brand in right there in the meeting. So again, focused, organized, concise. Another buyer told me, I've met with brands who don't understand their ingredients or don't really know their brand. So you've really got to be confident. You've got to be able to, in a very concise, direct manner, explain your brand proposition, the ingredients, why it exists, consumer target. So the more information that you can to provide is really the best approach. Another example is to make sure that you stay on topic. I had one buyer tell me that a brand came in who was an existing brand for a promotional planning session, and at the end they said, oh, well, we have these 10 new products that we want to share with you. And she was, this particular buyer was very upset by that because, the meeting was supposed to be about promotional planning for the next year, and then they came in trying to show new items as well. So that's a big no-no. A couple other things that a buyer is also going to want to know is, what are your manufacturing capabilities? how much capacity do you have? Can you meet the needs if the buyer does say, yes, we're interested in taking your brand? Another thing that their expectation is, and this is a big one, is that you can complete the vendor forms and new item forms. So I think that we heard from a couple buyers is that they've said yes to brands, but then the brands struggle to, get a certificate of insurance, get the necessary information, and they didn't even make it to the shelf because they couldn't complete the new item or the new vendor form. So I think that's really a critical piece as well to your success. But again, just, stay on topic. Short, one of the other things that we definitely advise the brands that we work with is to listen, more than you talk. So the most successful meetings that I've been in with buyers is where you're doing a lot of the listening and then you're explaining your brand proposition and how it meets their needs. So definitely recommend to our folks on today's webinar that do a lot of listening, a lot of note taking, and then if you're seeing the buyer doing a lot of listening and note taking as well, that's a very good point. And again, I can't emphasize enough that the buyer is looking for again, innovation and what you can do to help them, which we'll talk about a little bit in a couple pages. So, and then I think the last thing I would leave with you here is that the buyer, we heard a lot as well, is we're looking for a partnership. We're looking for brands, and that doesn't mean opening up, your wallet and giving them everything, but they're looking for brands that are willing to, partner with them to build a brand and to get their product, on their retail shelves and to be a successful brand. Bruce, what would you like to add?
Yeah, a couple things here, Tracy. Thank you. Tracy covered a lot of these, but just to reemphasize a couple of points that I heard was don't waste too much time telling these buyers about the category. We heard from several of them, I'm in the category, and several of the bigger ones are like, I'm a big part of the category. So unless you have a very, very unique take on it, or you have some proprietary research or a particular product that's going to exploit an inefficiency of a given market, then go into some detail there. The length of the deck was something we heard over and over and over. So I would encourage a couple of good ideas that came from buyers was if there's real technical things, whether it's ingredients or claims, if you're doing an OTC or a wellness product, put them in the appendix so that if the buyer might be a former pharmacist, so if they really want to talk about the claim behind XYZ, you've got it there, but you don't need to burn up your time. They do want to talk. I would say make sure, and again, this gets back to making sure you either understand the account or you've retained help that does. You want to go in here and you need to have an idea of what their hurdle rates are and what their expectations are. Because if you're asking them to take on certain items, you have to at least match, preferably beat, what they're going to replace it with. Otherwise, why would they do this? And one of the most telling things that I heard was a senior buyer who's held positions at several of the largest retailers in the country. This person said, I really only care about two things, and it's what I manage all day long, my time and my space. So the space I'm allocated in the stores and then the time of my team. He said, I don't have time to get involved with suppliers that are going to be needy. So to the point Tracy made, we heard from several of these buyers how they'd accepted items or accepted brands into programs, and then they just botched the follow-up. They couldn't get new item forms filled out. They couldn't get promotional paperwork processed on time. And a couple of buyers said also that that's a bit of a test. They want to see if the manufacturer is going to be able to figure these things out, or are they going to bury the admin or something with lots of little Mickey Mouse follow-up questions. Another thing to know is understand the calendars of these different retailers. For those of you that are veterans, you already know this, but for those of you that may not be as experienced, each account moves at their own pace. There'll be a call for new item presentations. There'll be line reviews. There'll be promo planning. And unless you're bringing something that's going to have some massive, Coke or Pepsi type budget or a big RX to OTC switch, you need to fit into their calendar of events. They're not going to bend for you. And again, this is where a specialty broker, or if you've been in the category a long time, you'll know what these dates are. A couple of other things. One buyer had a very interesting little system. He said, if I leave a meeting with a deck and I've put a star on it, it means I've learned something and I'm going to go back to that deck again. He said, no star, right into my shredder. So really try to be compelling. And as Tracy said, watch to see if they're taking notes. If they're taking notes and asking questions, you've really crossed an important bridge of engaging with the buyer. So that's well done. I think that's enough for now, Ari, if you wanted to move on.
Hey, I wanted to say one more thing before we move on about the category reviews. So there are specific retailers. One comes to mind, Publix, CVS. And, I know that I've worked with some brands that have been very frustrated about, trying to get meetings with these retailers and can't. And we've really had to explain to them, there is a category review schedule. And I don't care what you have as a brand or a product, they're going to stick to their category review. So if you're trying to get a meeting in June and their review's not till October and you're getting frustrated because you can't see the buyer, that's the reason why. Of course, there are retailers who don't have category review schedules. My recommendation is that's where you start, and then get a calendar of the reviews so you know when the next ones are and you're prepared to submit.
Hey, so one other thing, Ari, thank you, Tracy. Point 2 here is really big. We had several buyers say, listen, if you bring 100 people, I suggest they all have a role, but you're going to burn up a lot of time going through everyone's introductions. And they said, I'm leaving in 30 or 60 minutes. And something we'll talk about in another slide is you need to be ready to improvise, because unless you have the first meeting of the day, there's a good chance your buyer's going to be a little late or have to leave a little early. So you need to be ready to roll. And a buyer at a very large retailer had a pretty good quote. It was this. She said, I am a fan of efficient meetings, not large gatherings. So don't bring 8 people unless they really matter. Next, Ari, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce and Tracy. All, incredibly valuable information. I've always known, I've seen brands make so many mistakes where they just, bring out their deck and they just walk through it, slide after slide. And just lose the attention of that buyer. And then, you really have to focus in on storytelling. And, you want to tell the story of the brand, and you want to also focus on telling the story of the data that supports that brand. So yeah, we'll move on to the next slide here. So how should the brand prepare for one of these meetings?
So I'll take this, and Ari just made an excellent point. It gets back to what Tracy said in the opening. These retailers want to have a conversation. The example of the one-page win was fantastic. Love that story. Can't go into a lot of detail, but I'll guarantee a lot of you on the call right now probably have this product in your house. So we talk about how to prepare. They all liked an agenda. Some of them it was critical, some of it was a nice FYI. So I would say the counsel we would offer today is provide an agenda in advance, make sure you're clear on who you're bringing, because some buyers said they were very put off when they would go into the room and there's a lot more people than they thought. One person said that puts me on alert that this is going to be confrontational or not what I expected. If you bring your CEO, some buyers thought that was good because it showed kind of respect and importance. Others could not have cared less. If you do bring your CEO, make sure that man or woman has a role to play, and that they don't burn up too much of your time telling like the history of your brand. Because go back to the previous slide, these buyers are leaving in 30 or 60 minutes. Another couple of buyers said, I really appreciate an email 2 or 3 days before the meeting, just reminding me that the meeting's coming. It forces me to make sure it's still on my calendar. And it also is a quick reminder of what we're going to cover. So that I thought was good. Understanding the retailer that you're meeting with thoroughly. So this one got some really interesting answers. Several people said, you'd be surprised how many people come into a meeting with me and they'll ask me kind of a ridiculous question, like, how many stores do you guys have? Really? Have you not heard of Google? Have you not read an annual report? The suggestions were you should know our strategy for the individual retailer. You should be up to speed on our 10K so you know how we're doing financially. Probably should at least take a look at our annual report. Probably at least go out and look at, say, the Dow Jones news feed, see what the press releases are lately, and get into some stores, but not just one. Get into several stores if you can, or have your selling agent get into some stores, or if you have a team of more than 2 or 3 people, ask folks or even relatives to take some photos of these stores. Because when you go in to a retailer for a first shot, you've got to make a really good impression. So if you went to one store that's around the corner from the headquarters, they're going to know that. Okay, they're going to know that. And again, work with someone who knows this account thoroughly. We heard from many of the buyers we spoke to, speak crisply and clearly as to why your brand is different. So if you think back to the elevator pitch, that's what you want. If the buyer says, why are you different? Why are you the best cookie? Why are you the best sunscreen? Be ready to say it. Don't get into the science yet, but tell that story. Like Ari said, be engaging, pull them in. And then understand how your brand fits with the retailer. Is it on strategy? Is this going to meet their margin requirements? Tracy's going to go in a little bit more detail today, and then definitely in next week's session, about understanding the metrics that all of these category managers and buyers are held to. If you remember nothing else, remember this: these people care deeply about their category and how their category does within their operation. They don't really care about your brand. We heard many times that these buyers said, listen, I want to make sure I have an interesting, very profitable, engaging assortment for my shoppers, but to be perfectly candid, I must win with my big brands. So you kind of need to know your place as well. Lastly, before I kick this over to Tracy, is we had a lot of buyers say, you'd be surprised when I get toward the end of a meeting and I say, what do you want? And the vendor doesn't really know. They wanted to get through their deck was the answer and not miss their flight. Well, do you want distribution? Do you want to get into the holiday end cap? Do you want to be in a 200 store test? So have that answer, know why you're there. Of course, we all want distribution, but what do you want? Do you want a couple hundred stores so you can prove your supply chain out? Because last point before I kick it to Tracy, and this time I mean it, is one of the things these buyers all worry about with a smaller emerging brand is your supply chain stress tested? Can they trust giving you a big order? Not only do you have the capital to fill the order in terms of making the product, but can you ship it? So have all these things nailed. And if you have distribution already, know your scorecard going into this place. So if you're going to try to go, hey, we had a great test, let's expand. If you have something weird on your scorecard, don't hope they won't notice or bring it up, because they will. So just address that right away. Tracy?
Yeah, I think the best point you made is knowing what your ask is. Don't go to the meeting and not know. So are, questions to ask yourself: am I willing to take a test in 200 stores? If the retailer may have more than one banner, like an Ahold, do I want to maybe start out at, Giant Martin or another one of their banners? So really have that in mind. That's really a critical point couple things I wanted to add to understanding the retailer, not only store count, but who their consumer target is. So is it a Wegmans that has a, more of an upscale shopper? Is it a dollar store consumer? Or is it just a, basic, or maybe a high-end natural chain? So really know the retailer's consumer target. Also know what their promotional programs are, so that that'll help you develop your plan. So does the retailer offer demos? Is that an in-store demo program that they do themselves, or do you have to work through a third party? These are all things that your sales agency or broker should be able to help you with. Know what the costs of those programs are, and go in there to knowing this is the program that I can do, but also know that you can be flexible. So that if the buyer says, hey, I want you to do this, well, maybe I can do this, but I can't do the demos and what you're asking me to do. So really understand those promotional programs and what the costs are. The other thing that your sales agent or broker should be able to help you with is, what is the volume expectation, and so what is the category hurdle rate for like a distributor, like a UNFI on a grocery item? It's 5 cases per DC per item. Going in there, those are the kinds of things that you should know, so that when you're getting into that discussion with the buyer, what he's looking for and what those benchmarks are. And again, we can't emphasize enough Bruce's point about being able to ship and supply. We've experienced that recently, where a brand was in a major retailer and really had a difficult time getting product out to the stores for initial distribution. And know that that's just the kiss of death for retailers when they have an empty spot for a new item that a brand can't fulfill.
Hey, a couple of quick things that Tracy prompted. So a couple of little, I don't want to call them tricks, but I can't think of a better word. So that you should be aware of, unless you have that first meeting of the day, and even that can start a little late, always know what you and your team can cut out of your presentation if your buyer shows up 10 or 15 minutes late, or if they're right on time and say, hey, I got to cut this 10 or 15 minutes short. Just be aware so that doesn't catch you off guard. And then the other thing I like to do and coach my folks to do is, as soon as the meeting starts, just do a time check. You say, hey, Tracy, we're still good to 11, right? And if he says, yep, good, you did your duty, you checked. But if Tracy says, oh, I got to go 10 minutes early, my manager called a staff meeting, it puts that on the table versus Tracy going to stand up 10 minutes early and you're like, dude, where are you going? So just kind of clear the air on those things, but always good. I know the answer is you don't want to cut out anything because you and your team have rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed. But Mr. Murphy always shows up at the worst times. So just know those little bits that you can either power through or cut if you really had to. Ari?
Yeah, all really great advice. Two things that really resonated with me was, one thing is make sure you're bringing innovation to that category. Buyers are always looking for new innovation, and make sure you're articulating that really well. And the next thing is, it sounds simple, but make sure you're visiting these stores. You got to know these stores inside and out. You got to know your category. Make sure, like Bruce said, you visit more than just one store. They're going to know if you just went to the one down the street, and make sure you know the brands that are in your category. So we'll move on to the next slide here. So how does the buyer prepare for a meeting with the supplier?
Yeah, I'm going to take this one. So the first bullet point here, run a performance versus plan. So this is mostly if you're a current brand. Bruce alluded to a scorecard. So that's the first thing that the buyers that we spoke to talked about, that they're going to look at, how the brand is performing currently. And then, as you're bringing new items or new innovation, you need to make sure that you've got a really strong plan already and that you are already performing at a level that's acceptable to them before they're going to add, new items or more items to their set. The buyer's going to, again, review the key metrics for them, order fill rate, out of stocks, sales per week per store, all those good things. So most retailers have a customized sheet that they look at, a scorecard that they look at to see how the brand is, is performing. So what the buyers told us as far as prep goes is they're going to look for a new brand. They're going to look at the brand's website. They're going to look at your social media to see, how you are communicating your brand proposition. They're going to look at their current category. A couple buyers said, hey, if it's a really, crowded category, it's going to be tough. But so they're going to look at that. Another thing they're going to look at is, any kind of data, so spins, also IRI or Nielsen. I know, for example, at Publix, that's the first thing that they look at is, where is a new brand that they don't carry? Where is that? How is that brand performing, in the marketplace? And I know, again, in the Publix example, if you're not even registering, in a Nielsen or a Spins or an IRI, you're not really going to get their, attention. So again, we talked already about, sending an agenda in advance. And I think also, I think that's really all I had to say on that one.
Yeah, just two quick ads here. It's always a good idea to see, especially if you're already a vendor of one to one extent or another. Maybe you're in another category, or maybe you're executing a couple hundred store test with a large retailer right now. Always good to know if the buyer has anything on their mind, and this can be accomplished in that email a couple of days before. We heard that some buyers, they say, look, if I have something on my mind, I'll just hijack the meeting. Okay, so that's not great, because you guys are all amped up to cover what you want to cover. So best to know that. We had other buyers say, if I have an issue, I'll tell them right up front, hey, it's your time, but I need 10 minutes at the end. So again, draw out of them if something's on their mind. And if they start out, and this is hard because you've waited a long time for this meeting, but if they say something like, I got something on my mind, and if you can tell they may be a bit agitated, my counsel would be, take care of it right now, because otherwise you're going to worry about it for the rest of the meeting. And depending upon what it is, you may need to address that, or you're not going forward with anything else. So just be forewarned that it's always good to see if there's anything on the buyer's mind going in. And another piece of counsel we were given from more than one of these folks was, do not underestimate how much data we have and how good we are with it. So just, be alert to that. One of these people, she said, 10 years ago, we had a ton of data, but there was so much going on, we didn't really have time to always dig into it, except with our largest suppliers. But now we've all gotten better at data. We have analytic teams within our operation. So don't underestimate what we do know and what we have access to. Ari?
Yeah, super important information there. Thanks, guys. I know, from my personal experience, understanding that data is so incredibly important. Not just your own brand's data, but the category's data as a whole. So we'll move on here. The next slide, the buyer and their category.
Okay, so I'll start here. This is going to be the Bruce and Tracy show on this page. So the very first point here, we already spoke about, but all the buyers said the same thing. They are much more interested in their category performance than your brand performance. So if you really understand the category and you've done your homework, and your brand or your new item can be accretive to this, that's critical. And we're going to get into this a lot more. Tracy will in a second, but in next week's session. But these buyers, they're evaluated in their category on growing sales, expanding margin, Sometimes they measure it in share of their class of trade. A lot of them are under a lot of pressure to grow private label. A lot of them are under pressure in certain categories to be first to market. That's really important with some retailers, not as big a deal with others. And then for any of you that have been in this business more than one selling cycle, a lot of buyers are also under pressure to harvest trade dollars, A&P dollars from their vendor community. And that's something that Tracy and I will talk about next week, and he may touch on that here in a second. And I'll take the third point and then turn it over to Tracy. Be alert to the private label question. And by this, I mean, as Ari said, you know, uniqueness and differentiation is really key. It is not out of the question for your product, if it is perceived as unique, that the retailer may ask you to make their private label knockoff of your brand as a quid pro quo to getting distribution. I'm aware of one brand that had this happen to them in the OTC arena, and I'm aware of a brand that had this happen to them in the coffee arena. The coffee example, the retailer said, we will take your unique blend of coffee under your brand name if you also make us our store brand. And 6 months later, they dropped the brand, but held the manufacturer to the contract for a store brand. So the downside was they lost the business with the much better margin, and they really couldn't fall back on anything, right? Because they had other business with this retailer. So it was really unfortunate. So it's fair to say we'd like to go back and think about this, unless you already know what your answer is going to be, but you shouldn't look at them. Again, this really applies if you have a product that truly is unique. If they ask you about that, it shouldn't be like seeing a unicorn at the side of the road. I mean, that's a question you should anticipate is coming your way. Tracy?
Yeah, a couple things here that I wanted to add a little color to is, again, buyers are looking for innovation. They're looking for trends in new items. You've got to, again, I know we've said this over and over, but you've got to have a trend, you know, a trade spending support plan when you go in. I wanted to address two things on this that I heard is, one was a buyer said, you know, don't celebrate just that you got distribution. So it's not about just getting distribution. It's also about what's the plan to pull the product off the shelf and get it into consumers' carts. Buyers told us more than once that, you know, brands think that the holy grail is getting their brand on the shelf, and it's not. That's really, to quote a buyer, that's when the work really starts. So please keep that in mind. And the other, I guess, example that I would give in a meeting, won't share any names, but you don't want to come across as a used car salesman. You want to talk data, facts, and figures. What you don't want to say is, oh, my brand's going to sell like hotcakes. You need to take this brand. That just doesn't go over very well with buyers, and an example of something that you really just don't want to do. The other thing is, be prepared for that word called slotting or free fill. So many times a retailer will require that, and don't think that, I know I talked to brands, we're like, well, we're not going to pay that, okay? Or, we know we can negotiate that. Sometimes it's negotiable, sometimes it's not, but you need to go in not with eyes wide open that, a slotting for getting a new item on the shelf is probably going to be discussed in some form or fashion with almost every retailer. Sometimes it's negotiable and sometimes it's not, but don't kid yourself like, I'm not paying this, because it's going to be a really short conversation.
Yeah, so just to build on what Tracy said right there, that is a mistake I have made many times over my career. Being a cheap Scottish guy, I was early on, I couldn't bear the thought of paying slotting. And, several years ago, you could sometimes get away with it. But here's what that does. First off, you're going to pay one way or another. Either they might not take that extra SKU you want, you might not get the store count you want, you might get free fill, you might get deducted. I mean, there's all kinds of ways this is going to happen, but let me tell you what it buys you. It buys you availability at a date you can bank on, okay? Because something we're going to get into next week, which is important, is when that product hits the shelf, all of these buyers are hitting the start button, and you have a very finite period of time to perform.
Yeah.
So if you kid yourself like Bruce used to, that I'm going to be penny wise and pound foolish, I might not get the distribution I want. Therefore, I can't justify starting my marketing plan. Therefore, I am burning my 90 to 180 day window to prove myself. And if you fail early, good luck getting new stuff in. So to Tracy's point, this is just kind of a cost of doing business. It's the Corleone offer you can't refuse. You're going to pay it, but try to negotiate it, but it's coming. But you might be able to do it in terms of optimizing store count, having a little more say in what your assortment might be. But to think you'll get around it is tough. Ari?
Yeah. No, that's really good information. I just want to, emphasize something that Tracy said there that, really resonated with myself and our brand experiences. Getting into the stores is definitely not the hardest part of this game. Getting that product off of the shelf is the hardest part of this game, and one of the most important things. And having that plan of how you're going to get that product off the shelf is really what that buyer wants to hear. So I just want to thank Bruce and Tracy. If I'd love if anybody else has any last questions, please submit them below. We'll go ahead and answer those questions now. Okay, so the first question that we have here, Tracy or Bruce, let me know who you want to handle this one. It says, do I need a broker or sales agency to represent me?
Tracy?
Absolutely. You definitely need somebody that's an expert that knows the retailer really, really well. We call them a sales Sherpa or a brand Sherpa that can help you navigate that retailer, because every retailer is different. Every retailer has different nuances, and you do need that expertise to help you go through the process, even if it's just filling out the new item forms and helping you get set up as a new vendor. That's just so valuable.
Yeah, and I can build on that. During my times running commercial operations for several companies, I was resistant to take on specialty brokers because I was being short-sighted and only saw the cost side of the equation. And I will name some names. Ultimately, I ended up finding a group to handle Target, to handle each of the large chain drug, to handle Whole Foods. And my business improved almost immediately because I was now dealing with people that were in those buildings every day versus my team that might be in there every other month. So in the end, you have to make your own decisions, but you should give that extremely strong consideration, because while you might save some short-term money not engaging these professionals, it's going to hurt your growth.
Right.
Yeah, so our next question here is, how do I know what retailers I should sell to?
Bruce, I'll let you take that.
I'll go first there. Thank you. So it gets back to the question of kind of knowing your consumer and then doing your homework with these retailers. The example I gave earlier was if you have a very expensive, say natural or organic or a skincare product that has a very expensive active ingredient, probably not a great candidate for the dollar stores for a couple of reasons. The price point will be too high, and it might get identified as a potential high theft item, which then you'd get hit with some sort of fine for doing that. So you really need to build that profile of who your optimal consumer is, and then take a look at what retailers you make the most sense in. Because there's definitely an order and a sequence that you should go to retail. A quick example would be if you have a new item and you're fortunate enough that, you know, a Walmart or an HEB might consider carrying it. On the one hand, that's great news. They're highly professional, well-run, top shelf retailers. However, they're also known for being extremely tough on price. Okay. So if you go into a place like that first, and they kind of take a little less margin, beat you down on price because they're going to do some good volumes, as you go to some of the smaller regional players, they're going to look at the price point at Walmart and say, I can't make money at that price. So they won't even consider you. So you really want to make sure you think through not only your consumer, that's square one. You got to know who your consumer is, then which retailers are a good match. And once you even have that list built of who's a good match, you need to put that in order. Tracy, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think we really strongly recommend that you start with a strategy. And again, it's got to fit, you know, your brand's got to fit with the retailer's consumer. And, you know, and I think also you have to take into account what your production capacity is. If you're a new brand and you want to say, oh, well, I want to go and get into CVS, are you prepared to, you know, ship and have the capabilities to, you know, get your products into, you know, 4,000, you know, CVS stores as an example. So we really talk about, you know, what is the best class by a class of trade, what is the best fit for a brand, and then drill down into that channel. Like Bruce talked about, you know, your brand may not be a good fit for the dollar channel, or it may be not a good fit for the club channel, as an example. So yeah, start with strategy and know what your capabilities are from a production standpoint and how that matches the retailer's consumer.
And to build just one more thing on Tracy's point there is, as you know, the retailers that you're focusing on, if you're dealing with people that understand the margin requirements, et cetera, of those retailers, you got to take a hard look in the mirror and challenge yourself. Are you going to sell at the rate of sale or at the margin of the items that might be coming out? Because we had more than one buyer say, you know, store hours are expensive for me to request and have allocated to my P&L. So Bruce, why would I put your item in, even if it tastes great or whatever? Why would I take your item in and knock something out that's already more productive? The only reason this makes mathematics sense for me is if you're going to help build my category or build my margin. So you have to know that. And then two other points. At the end of these surveys, we said, you know, what advice might you have to a smaller emerging brand? And two that tied into some commentary Tracy made and Ari had made a moment ago was, one, do not cut that first order. Do not cut that first order. Ship it full and ship it on time. And the second thing these buyers are worried about with small and emerging brands is, and the quote I wrote down here is your supply chain stress tested? So one, can you handle a big order to a large retailer? And then two, if you get traction, which obviously we're hoping for, we wouldn't have gone through the work to get distribution, can you keep up? You know, do you have the funding to continue to make inventory? Is your supply chain, you know, top shelf? You can ship on time. Those are things that you think are easy, and those are usually the ones that jump up and bite you. Ari, do we have any more?
Yeah, we got a few more questions here, but I just wanted to add a little bit of 2 cents to that last one. You know, actually some great advice that I heard from my good friend Justin from Justin's Nut Butter always was, he has this little saying called own your home. And what own your home means is, you know, focus locally, focus regionally, really build, you know, your audience. Once you've got some traction there locally, then you can really expand. I know a lot of brands, you know, get a little overzealous and kind of make the mistake of like, oh, I want to be national, I want to be everywhere. But, you know, it's really counterproductive. So really own your home is one of my favorite, you know, sayings in this business.
That's a great saying. Great
right?
saying. Yeah.
So yeah, the next question we got here is, will there be a session on how to put together a plan to get products off the shelf into consumers' baskets?
Yeah, I'll give that one I'll give that one a swing. So next week we're covering the rest of these questions that we ask the buyers, and one of the parts in there was around the content of the presentation and what they're looking for. And a huge part of that, yes, price is always a key point, but they wanted to see that marketing plan or demand plan, because again, as commercial operations folks, which I'm assuming all of us are on this phone, there's really only three core components: get the product on the shelf, have a plan to move it off the shelf, and somewhere in between, make sure you're managing your costs in such a manner that you can stay in business to continue to ship product to move it off the shelf. But we can talk about, that would be something I'd encourage you to send us an email to the link that Ari showed, and we'll put up at the last page. If you have a really specific question around building out a marketing plan or a demand plan, we might be able to address that offline to make sure we're hitting exactly what you want. Tracy, anything to add there?
No, I think that's a great idea. That's why we've got that email set up for further in-depth questions.
Perfect. So yeah, our next question is, how do you find good brokers? Is there a resource out there to help you do this?
I'll go first there. So every large retailer, the buyers all have a network of brokers that they work with. Every one of the buyers I interviewed, they said they're glad to provide that list, but they will only provide a list. They won't play favorites. They'll say, look, if you have an HBA or an OTC item, here's 5 people that are really knowledgeable about dealing with us. So, you know, give them a call, but it's up to you to vet them. They're not gonna, they have no idea what they charge. They may have people that they like more or less than others, but they're not, at least the people I talk to, aren't going to play favorites, but they're willing to provide a list of people that give you the best chance to be successful, rather than be the group that fumbles the new item paperwork and you miss your chance. Tracy, you know a lot about this.
Yeah, so what I would do is I would use your network. So if you're already in consumer packaged goods, I'd reach out to folks that you know and trust, or I would, reach out to other people that you know and look for, a recommendation, or reach out, to a brand or a CEO or somebody, on LinkedIn, and connect with them and say, hey, do you have a recommendation of somebody that you used or have used in the past? So ask the specific retailer, and then the second thing I would say is network.
Yeah, some great advice there. And our next question is, where to find information on hurdle rates for a category?
Tracy, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I would, again, if you're using a broker or a sales agency, they should be able to provide that information for you. If you know of somebody that can get you some category data or some specific sales data, that's what I would look at.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Several of the buyers said that they're always willing to volunteer that information, but you need to ask them. They'll put out what grading the paper. Very few people won't share what it takes to be successful, but if you'd like to know that going into this first meeting, as Tracy said, work with someone who knows the account, or kind of a real back of the cocktail napkin way to do it is if you have access to some IRI or Nielsen data. If it's account specific, perfect, but at least if it can be class of trade specific, go down that product ranking report and draw a line at about the 80% mark, and you need to be above that. And then you can do some rough calculations of what the bottom would have to be viable. And again, they don't want you to be the very last SKU in their shelf set. They would love you to be in the top 10%, not sneaking in the 78th percentile.
Well, it looks like, guys, we're out of time today, but really want to thank, Bruce and Tracy for, sharing all this wealth of information with us today. And thank you for everyone else for attending our webinar, securing your appointment and preparing for the meeting. I appreciate everyone for taking an hour out of their day with us here at the Road to Retail. As a reminder, I'll be sending out today's webinar recording as well as slides for everyone tomorrow. So keep an eye out in your inbox. If you'd like to join us again for part 2 of this webinar, Presenting Your Brand and Proper Follow-Up, visit the same link next week, May 13th at 12 p.m. Central Time. Well, thank you so much, and everyone have a wonderful day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.